Thunder rolled across the grey afternoon sky, and lightning flashed over the massive western mansion like nature itself was angry. The mansion, a symbol of power and wealth, stood at the edge of the city, its golden gates guarding secrets that money couldn't hide. Inside, the polished marble floors shone like mirrors, and chandeliers sparkled with diamonds that could feed 100 hungry families. But despite all that luxury, the house felt cold, almost haunted. Grace Johnson, the maid, was quietly folding laundry in the hallway. She hummed a soft tune, an old gospel song her mother used to sing when times were hard. Grace had been working in the Western Mansion for 3 years. Everyone in the neighborhood knew her as a kind woman, gentle, hard-working and humble. She had 2 children of her own, and she took this job to give them a better future. But to Grace, the real light of this mansion wasn't the gold or the chandeliers. It was Emily Weston, the billionaire's 10-year-old daughter, a bright, beautiful little girl with curly hair and an innocent smile. Grace loved Emily like her own child. She'd braid her hair in the mornings, read her bedtime stories, and sometimes sneak cookies for her when her father wasn't watching. That day, though, something felt different. The air inside the mansion was heavy, as if something terrible was about to happen. Grace was heading upstairs to put away the freshly ironed sheets when she heard it. A piercing scream that froze her heart. The sound came from Emily's room. Grace dropped everything and ran. "Emily, sweetheart, what happened?" she shouted, rushing through the doorway. Emily sat on the floor, crying, her small hands clutching her cheek. The sight made Grace's knees weaken. She rushed forward. "Oh, my lord, are you hurt?" she asked, reaching out gently. But before Grace could touch her, the door behind her slammed open. Standing there was Richard Weston, Emily's father, the billionaire whose name commanded respect and fear alike. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with silver-streaked hair and eyes that could freeze anyone in place. His business empire stretched across the globe, but at home he ruled with an iron hand. "What's going on here?" he thundered. His deep voice echoed against the walls. His gaze fell on Emily, who was crying, and then shifted sharply to Grace. Emily hiccuped between sobs, her voice trembling. She hit me, Daddy." The words hit Grace like a slap. "What?" she gasped. No, I didn't." Richard's face twisted with fury. "You did what?" he roared, stepping closer. His hand pointed accusingly at Grace. "You dare lay a hand on my daughter?" "Sir, please," Grace pleaded, her voice shaking. "I swear on my children I would never hurt her." She tripped. "I just came in when I heard her scream." But he wasn't listening. Billionaires weren't used to listening. They were used to commanding, judging and controlling. To him, the maid was already guilty. His anger wasn't just about Emily's tears. It was about power, pride, and the fear of losing control. "Don't you dare lie to me," he shouted, his voice echoing through the house. "I took you in, gave you a job, trusted you, and this is how you repay me." Grace's voice broke. "Please, sir, you've known me for years." "Ask Emily again." "I didn't." But Emily buried her face in her father's chest, sobbing harder. "She hit me because I spilled juice on the floor," she said between cries. The room fell silent. The rain outside grew louder, pounding against the windows like drums of judgment. Grace's hands trembled. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Emily, the same child she'd loved and cared for, was lying, but why? Richard Weston's jaw clenched. Without another word, he pulled out his phone. His tone was cold, final. "I'm calling the police." Grace froze. "Please, sir, no. Let me explain." But he turned away, pacing as he spoke sharply into the phone. "Yes, officer. I need someone arrested immediately. Assault on a minor. My maid attacked my daughter." Grace's knees buckled. "Emily," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Why are you saying this?" "I didn't hurt you." "I love you, baby." Emily didn't answer. She just stared at the floor, her tiny shoulders shaking. Moments later, the sound of sirens echoed in the distance. Blue and red lights flashed through the rain-soaked windows. Grace's heart pounded so hard it hurt. She felt like she was trapped in a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. As the police knocked on the grand doors of the Weston Mansion, Grace whispered one last prayer. "Lord, please let the truth come out. Don't let this be the end of me." But deep down, she knew, when a poor black maid stood against a billionaire's word, the truth didn't matter. The officers stepped inside, their boots squeaking on the marble floor. "Ma'am," one of them said, "you're under arrest." And as the cold metal cuffs clicked around her wrists, Grace's world shattered. One scream, one lie. And one powerful man had just destroyed everything she'd worked for. The wail of police. Sirens grew louder until it filled the air. Outside the Weston mansion, blue and red lights flashed through the rain, dancing across the white marble walls like warning signs from heaven. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, whispering to each other, shocked to see law enforcement arriving at the home of one of the richest men in the state. Grace stood frozen in the middle of the living room. Her heart pounded so hard she could barely breathe. The thunder outside seemed to echo her fear. She whispered a silent prayer, "God, please let this be a mistake, please." The front doors swung open, and two uniformed officers stepped in, their boots tracking water across the spotless floor. Richard Weston stood tall, his expression cold and commanding. His hand pointed at Grace like a judge delivering a sentence. "That's her," he said firmly. "She's the one who hit my daughter." The officers exchanged glances before approaching Grace. "Ma'am," one said, his tone professional but distant, "we received a report of assault on a minor. We'll need you to come with us." Grace's hands trembled as she stepped back. "No, please. I didn't touch her. I love that little girl. She's lying, please." "Mum," the officer interrupted softly, "we can discuss that at the station." "Please turn around." Emily stood on the staircase, clutching her teddy bear. Her little face was pale, her eyes wide. She looked scared, but not in the way an innocent child would be. It was guilt buried deep. Still, she said nothing. "Emily," Grace whispered, her voice cracking. "Tell them the truth, baby. You know I would never hurt you." But the girl's lips stayed sealed. One small tear rolled down her cheek, but she didn't speak. Richard's voice was sharp. "Don't you dare talk to my daughter again." Grace looked at him, disbelief flooding her eyes. "Sir, I've taken care of her since her mother passed away. I've been here every day, every night. You know I love her like she's my own. Please don't do this." But Richard didn't waver. "You've already done enough damage. I trusted you and you betrayed that trust. You think a few tears can wash away what you did?" Grace fell to her knees, sobbing. "Please, sir, please." The officers gently lifted her up and turned her around. The cold metal cuffs clicked around her wrists. She flinched at the sound. It felt like the whole world had collapsed on her shoulders. As they led her out, the mansion staff gathered silently in the hallway. The chef, the driver, the housekeeper, all stood with lowered eyes. No one dared to speak up. No one dared to challenge the billionaire's word. Grace's voice echoed through the grand halls one last time. "Emily?" "Sweetheart, please tell them the truth." Emily's small voice trembled from the staircase. "I'm sorry," she whispered so softly no one else could hear. Outside rain poured relentlessly, soaking Grace's uniform as the officers guided her to the police car. She shivered, not from the cold but from heartbreak. Every step felt like walking away from everything she'd ever cared about. The flashing lights reflected in the puddles as she was pushed gently into the back seat. She turned her head one last time toward the mansion. The home that once gave her hope now stood like a prison of lies. Through the blurred window, she saw Richard comforting Emily, wrapping his coat around her. To anyone watching, it looked like a father protecting his child. But Grace knew there was more to the story, something darker hiding behind those walls. As the car pulled away, the driver's radio crackled faintly. Grace rested her head against the cold glass, tears mixing with the rain outside. Memories flooded her mind. Emily's laughter, the stories they shared, the nights she stayed up when the child had nightmares. She had been more than a maid. She had been family. Now she was nothing more than a criminal in handcuffs. When they reached the station, the air inside was even colder than the rain. The fluorescent lights buzzed above her head as the officers led her through the narrow hallways. People stared, some with pity, others with judgment. They took her fingerprints, snapped her photo, and asked her to remove her jewelry. She did so silently, her hands shaking. The gold cross necklace she wore, a gift from her late mother, was placed in a small plastic bag. Then came the moment she dreaded most. The cell door opened with a metallic creak. The officer motioned her inside. "You'll be here until your hearing." Grace stepped in slowly. The room was small, grey and lifeless. She sat on the cold metal bench and buried her face in her hands. Her heart ached not just from fear but from betrayal. How could she lie? She whispered through sobs. "Why, Emily? What did I do to deserve this?" She thought of her 2 children back home waiting for her to call. How would she explain this to them? How could she tell them that their mother, who taught them to always tell the truth, had been destroyed by a lie? The hours passed, but sleep never came. The sound of thunder outside slowly faded, replaced by silence. Grace stared at the ceiling and whispered a prayer. "God, I don't understand this pain, but if you're real, please don't let this be the end of my story." Outside, the city lights flickered, and somewhere, deep inside the Weston mansion, a little girl lay awake, clutching her teddy bear, crying silently into the darkness because the truth was too heavy for her small heart to carry. A week passed. To Grace, it felt like a lifetime. The days in jail blurred together. Cold mornings, sleepless nights, and endless prayers whispered through tears. But finally the day arrived. The day she would face the billionaire, his lawyers, and the world that had already decided she was guilty. The courthouse was packed long before the trial began. Cameras lined the steps outside, their flashes lighting up the grey sky. Reporters shouted questions, eager for a headline. "Did the maid really hit the billionaire's daughter?" "Is this another scandal in the Western Empire?" Inside, the air was tense. Every whisper carried weight. On one side sat Richard Weston, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, surrounded by a team of expensive attorneys. His face was calm, but his eyes were sharp, cold, and filled with pride. Across the aisle, Grace sat beside her young lawyer, Maya Thompson, a public defender barely in her 30s. She didn't have money or power, but she had something rare: belief. When everyone else turned away, Maya had looked at Grace and said, "I believe you." Grace sat silently, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She wore the same plain dress she'd been arrested in. Her heart pounded as the bailiff called, "All rise for the Honorable Judge Simmons." The courtroom stood. The judge, an older man with tired eyes, took his seat. "You may be seated," he said. The prosecutor stood first. His voice was loud, confident, and full of authority. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is simple. The defendant, Grace Johnson, assaulted a 10-year-old girl under her care. We will prove that this was not an accident, but an act of violence from a woman who lost her temper." He turned and pointed directly at Grace. The victim was terrified. The father, Mr. Weston, saw the aftermath himself. And today you'll hear the truth, from the child's own mouth. Grace lowered her head, tears slipping down her cheeks. She wanted to shout that it was all a lie, but Maya placed a gentle hand on hers. "Don't speak," she whispered. "Not yet. We'll have our turn." When the prosecutor finished, Maya stood. She wasn't loud, she wasn't fancy, but her calm voice carried strength. "Your Honor, my client is a mother, a caregiver, and a woman of faith. She has worked for the Weston family for years without a single complaint. She has no history of violence, no reason to harm the very child she loved. We ask only that you keep your minds open, because not every story is as it seems." The judge nodded. "Proceed with the witnesses." And then it happened. The courtroom doors opened and little Emily Weston walked in. The room fell silent. She looked so small standing there, her white dress crisp, her hair tied neatly with ribbons. In her hands, she held her teddy bear, the same one Grace had given her for her birthday. Richard's eyes softened for a brief moment as he guided her to the stand. He whispered something in her ear before stepping back. Emily's small hand rested on the Bible as she took the oath. Her voice trembled. I promise to tell the truth." The prosecutor approached gently, trying not to scare her. "Emily, sweetheart, can you tell us what happened that day?" Emily hesitated. Her eyes darted around the room until they landed on Grace. The woman she once loved like a mother now sat behind a table, pale and broken. "Go on," the prosecutor encouraged. "You're safe now." Emily took a shaky breath. I spilled juice on the floor. Grace got mad and she hit me." Gasps filled the courtroom. Grace's breath caught in her throat. No, that's not true," she whispered. but Maya squeezed her arm to keep her quiet. The prosecutor nodded sympathetically. "Did it hurt, sweetheart?" Emily nodded slowly. "Yes." "And what did Grace say afterward?" "She said I deserved it." "Because I made a mess." Richard Weston lowered his head, pretending to wipe away a tear. Cameras clicked rapidly, capturing every expression. Grace couldn't believe what she was hearing. The same child she'd comforted through nightmares. The one who used to call her Mama Grace was lying. But why? Maya leaned close and whispered, "Stay strong. Don't break. I'll find the truth." When Emily stepped down from the witness stand, she didn't look at Grace. Her eyes were filled with guilt, but her small shoulders carried the weight of her father's expectations. The judge turned to the prosecutor. "Call your next witness." Grace sat there numb as the courtroom buzzed with whispers. To everyone watching, it looked like an open and shut case, a powerful man, a crying child, and a poor maid. But Maya's mind was racing. Something about Emily's story didn't add up. Her pauses, her hesitation, the way her voice trembled. It wasn't fear of Grace, it was fear of something else. As the session ended for the day, Maya turned to her client and said quietly, "Grace, I don't think that little girl is lying to hurt you. I think she's lying because she's scared." Grace looked at her confused. "Scared of what?" Maya's voice dropped. "Scared of her father." And at that moment, Grace felt a chill run down her spine. Maybe for the first time, she realized that Emily's lie wasn't out of hatred, but out of fear. And that meant the truth was much darker than anyone in that courtroom could imagine. That night, after the courtroom had emptied and the flashing cameras faded away, Maya Thompson sat alone in her small office, staring at the file in front of her. The file had Grace's name written across it in bold letters. Grace Johnson versus the state. She had represented many clients before, but something about this case felt different. Something wasn't right. She leaned back in her chair, exhaustion written across her face. Why would a child lie like that? She whispered to herself. Why would a little girl accuse the one person who clearly loved her? Her mind replayed Emily's testimony over and over again. The hesitation, the quiver in her voice, the way she clutched her teddy bear tightly, almost protectively, and that moment when she glanced at her father before answering every question. That wasn't the behavior of a confident witness. That was the behavior of a scared child. Maya picked up her coat and decided she couldn't sleep without answers. There was something buried in that mansion. Something Grace didn't know or couldn't see. The next morning, she drove to the Weston estate. The massive iron gates opened slowly, the security guards eyeing her with suspicion. She flashed her legal badge. Attorney Maya Thompson. "I'm here to speak with the staff." Inside, the house was spotless, almost unnaturally quiet. The echoes of luxury filled every corner. But underneath there was tension. A maid was dusting the piano. A gardener arranged flowers in the hallway. They all looked nervous when Maya approached. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Maya said gently. "I just want to know the truth about Grace. And about Emily." The staff exchanged wary looks. Most stayed silent, afraid of losing their jobs. But one man, the gardener named Henry, hesitated before finally speaking up. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "Grace was a good woman. She treated everyone kindly. Especially the little girl." Maya nodded. "Then why would Emily accuse her?" Henry looked around nervously. "Because that child's been scared for a long time. I've seen things no one talks about." Maya's heart pounded. "What kind of things?" He swallowed hard. "Bruises on her arms, on her legs. When people asked, Mr. Weston said she fell down the stairs or got hurt playing. But those bruises, they didn't look like accidents." Maya's breath caught. "Are you saying—" Henry raised his hand. "Don't say it out loud, Mom. This place has eyes everywhere. But I'll tell you this. Grace wasn't the one hurting that child. She was the one protecting her." The truth hit Maya like a punch to the chest. Grace had been accused of the very thing she'd been trying to prevent. Later that day, Maya visited Grace in jail. The older woman looked tired, but her eyes still carried that quiet dignity, the kind that comes from faith and years of endurance. Maya sat down across from her. "Grace," she said softly, "I need to ask you something personal. Did you ever notice bruises on Emily before this happened?" Grace nodded slowly, her voice trembling. Yes, I did. She always said she fell or ran into something, but I knew better. I didn't say anything because I was scared too. Scared of what? Maya asked. Grace took a deep breath. Scared of her father. Maya leaned closer. Did he ever hurt you? Grace shook her head. Not me, but he had a temper. I've seen him shout at her over little things. Once she dropped his coffee, and he threw the cup across the room. She flinched like she expected to be hit. I wanted to say something, but he's powerful. You don't challenge a man like Richard Weston if you want to keep your job. Her voice broke. And now I'm paying for my silence. Maya's eyes glistened. You're not alone anymore, Grace. We're going to uncover the truth. That night, Maya worked tirelessly, gathering evidence. She found school reports that mentioned Emily's frequent injuries. She called her teachers, who quietly admitted they'd been concerned for a long time, but were too afraid to question a billionaire parent. Piece by piece, the puzzle began to take shape. Every document, every whispered confession, every photo told the same story. Emily wasn't lying to destroy Grace. She was lying to protect someone she was terrified of. Maya knew the next step was risky. She needed to bring Emily back to the stand. But this time she wouldn't let the child hide behind fear. She'd give her a chance to speak from her heart. Before leaving her office, Maya looked at Grace's photo again. A woman who had lost everything, her freedom, her dignity, her peace, all because she had chosen love over fear. Maya whispered to herself, You don't deserve this, Grace, and neither does that little girl. The next morning, she filed a motion for Emily to testify again. Richard Weston's lawyers laughed, confident that nothing could break their client's power. But Maya wasn't afraid anymore. She had seen the truth, and once the truth is seen, it can't be buried again. Somewhere in the city, under a thick blanket of guilt and fear, a 10-year-old girl stared at the ceiling of her expensive bedroom, whispering to her teddy bear, I want to tell the truth. And that was the moment the tide began to turn. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as people filled the seats for the second hearing. The press was everywhere, cameras flashing, reporters murmuring, pens scratching across notepads. It wasn't just a case anymore. It had become a national headline. Billionaire's Maid on trial for child abuse. Grace sat quietly at the defense table, her hands folded tightly, a single tear sliding down her cheek. The orange glow of the morning sunlight filtered through the tall courtroom windows, landing on her face. She looked fragile, broken, but not defeated. Beside her sat Maya Thompson, her young lawyer, flipping through notes, her mind focused but her heart heavy. Across the room, Richard Weston looked as calm as ever. He leaned back in his chair, his expensive suit spotless, his expression unreadable. To the cameras, he was the image of a grieving father, a man seeking justice for his daughter. But Maya knew better. Behind those cold eyes hid something dark, something that terrified his little girl into silence. The judge entered and the courtroom rose. After everyone was seated, the judge spoke. We will now continue the testimony. The prosecution may call its next witness. The prosecutor stood. Your Honor, we'd like to recall Emily Weston to the stand. Her quiet murmur spread across the room. The little girl walked in again, holding her teddy bear just like before. But this time there was something different about her. Her steps were slower, her eyes heavier. She looked like a child, carrying the weight of the entire world on her small shoulders. As she sat down, Maya noticed the faint bruise near Emily's wrist, half hidden by her sleeve. Her heart clenched. There it is again, she thought, another bruise. The prosecutor began, smiling softly. Emily, sweetheart, you remember why you're here, right? Emily nodded. Can you remind us what happened that day? The courtroom held its breath. Emily's lips parted, but no words came out. She glanced toward her father. Richard Weston's eyes met hers, cold, commanding, warning. Her fingers tightened around the teddy bear. I spilled juice, she whispered. And Grace got angry. Grace closed her eyes in pain. Maya noticed Emily's trembling voice, her shallow breathing, her eyes darting toward her father after every sentence. When the prosecutor finished, Maya rose from her chair. Your Honor, may I cross-examine the witness? The judge nodded. Proceed, Miss Thompson. Maya walked slowly to the front, stopping just a few feet away from the little girl. Her voice was calm and gentle, like a mother talking to her child. "Hi, Emily. My name's Maya. I know this must be scary for you. I just want to talk, okay?" Emily nodded timidly. Maya smiled softly. "You and Grace were close, weren't you?" A tiny flicker of emotion crossed the girl's face. "Yes," she whispered. "She read you bedtime stories?" Emily nodded again. "She tucked you in when you had bad dreams?" "Yes." Maya took a deep breath. "Emily, do you remember this?" She held up a photograph. It was Grace and Emily baking cookies together, flour on their hands, both laughing. The entire courtroom fell silent. Emily stared at the picture. Her lower lip trembled. "That was the day before." "The day before what happened?" Maya asked softly. "The day before everything changed." Maya knelt down, her eyes level with Emily's. "Sweetheart, I need you to be very brave right now. I know it's hard, but sometimes the truth sets us free." Emily's eyes welled with tears. She looked toward her father again. His jaw was clenched, his stare sharp and threatening. Her small hands began to shake. "Emily," Maya whispered, "did Grace really hurt you?" The little girl's lips trembled. Silence filled the courtroom. You could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Finally, Emily's voice broke through the stillness. It was small, but it shattered the entire room. "No," she whispered. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. The prosecutor froze mid-step. The judge leaned forward. Maya's voice was gentle. "Then who did, sweetheart?" Tears spilled down Emily's cheeks. She hugged her teddy bear tighter, her voice cracking. "It was Daddy," she said. "He hit me. Han told me to say it was Grace. He said if I didn't, he'd send me away." The courtroom exploded in murmurs. Reporters jumped up. The judge banged his gavel. "Order, order in the court." Richard Weston's face turned ghostly white. "She's lying," he shouted. "That's not true." But Emily kept crying, her small voice trembling with every word. "He gets angry when I mess up. I didn't want Grace to go to jail." "I'm sorry." Grace covered her mouth, sobbing uncontrollably. Maya placed a hand over her heart, tears filling her own eyes. The judge turned to the bailiff. "Clear the courtroom. We will continue in closed session." As chaos erupted, Richard Weston stood up, shouting, "You don't understand. I'm her father." But the truth had already been spoken, and it rang louder than his wealth, louder than his power. Emily clung to Maya, crying into her shoulder. "I didn't mean to hurt her. I was scared." Maya stroked her hair gently. "You did the right thing, sweetheart. You're brave now, and no one will ever hurt you again." For the first time in days, Grace lifted her eyes toward the heavens. Through tears, she whispered, "Thank you. Lord," the truth finally came out. The courtroom that had once been filled with doubt and lies was now echoing with the sound of freedom, freedom born from the courage of a frightened little girl who had finally found her voice. The courtroom was dead silent after Emily's confession. The words hung in the air like thunder that refused to fade. Everyone stared at the little girl, whose tear-streaked face trembled with both fear and relief. Richard Weston, the billionaire once admired for his wealth and influence, sat frozen at the plaintiff's table. His hands clenched the armrests of his chair, his knuckles turning white. The perfect image he had built over decades, the philanthropist, the businessman, the loving father, was crumbling right in front of hundreds of eyes. The judge's gavel struck sharply. "Mr. Weston, control yourself." But Richard was far from control. His mask was slipping. His voice trembled with rage. "She's lying. My daughter's confused. She doesn't know what she's saying." Maya Thompson rose to her feet. "Your Honor, the child is clearly traumatized, but her testimony is consistent with the physical evidence, bruises, that match adult handprints, a history of fear, and a child's desperate attempt to protect someone she loves." Richard slammed his hand on the table. "You think you can ruin me with the words of a child? I built everything, my name, my empire. Do you think I'd throw that away over lies?" The judge's gaze hardened. "Mr. Weston, you will remain silent unless spoken to." But Richard's pride wouldn't let him stop. "That woman," he pointed at Grace, his finger shaking, "she manipulated my daughter. She turned her against me." Grace flinched but stayed silent, her tears glistening under the courtroom lights. Maya turned to face him, her voice calm but cutting. "No, Mr. Weston. What broke your daughter wasn't Grace's kindness, it was your cruelty. You can't buy innocence, and you can't bury truth with money." The crowd gasped softly. The judge motioned for order again. Then Maya approached the bench with a file. "Your Honor, the defense would like to submit new evidence, security footage from the Weston estate, recovered by a private investigator." A ripple of tension spread across the room. The judge nodded. "Proceed." The screen came to life. The grainy video showed Richard's mansion hallway. The date matched the night of the alleged incident. At first, everything seemed quiet. Then the camera caught a moment that froze everyone in place. Richard's voice echoed through the speakers. "You worthless child. You think crying will fix what you broke?" The sound of glass shattering. Emily's whimpering voice. And then a shadowy figure raising a hand. The video ended abruptly. The courtroom erupted. Reporters whispered furiously. Spectators gasped. And Richard's lawyer sank into his chair, pale and speechless. Richard's voice cracked, almost pleading now. "It's not what it looks like. She provoked me. You don't understand how much pressure I'm under." But the judge's face was stone. "Mr. Weston, this court understands perfectly. You stand accused of child abuse, perjury, and obstruction of justice. Bailiff, place him under arrest." The gavel struck again, and the sound echoed like the fall of a giant. The bailiff approached, but Richard staggered backward, shaking his head. "No, you can't do this to me. I'm Richard Weston. I made this city what it is." Maya's voice cut through his hysteria, quiet but firm. "No, Mr. Weston, you made an empire out of greed and fear. But today your daughter tore it down with the truth." Richard's eyes darted toward Emily. His expression shifted, rage melting into despair. "Emily, I did it for you," he said weakly. "Everything I ever did was for you." Emily, sitting beside Grace, looked at him with tears streaming down her small face. "I just wanted you to love me, Daddy," she whispered. The words pierced through him like a blade. His knees buckled, and for a brief second, the mighty billionaire looked small. Just a broken man drowning in the consequences of his own actions. As the officers handcuffed him, flashes from cameras filled the room. His once proud posture slumped. The empire of arrogance and wealth had finally collapsed, not from a business rival, not from financial ruin, but from the truth spoken by the one person he thought he could control. Outside the courthouse, the story had already exploded. News channels replayed the footage over and over. Headlines flashed across every screen. "Billionaire arrested for child abuse, daughter's testimony. Shocks the nation." But inside the courthouse, amid the chaos, something tender happened. Grace turned to Emily, kneeling beside her. The little girl looked lost, trembling, unsure what would happen next. Grace gently held her hand. "You were brave, Emily," she said softly. "You saved us both." Emily leaned into her, her small arms wrapping around Grace's neck. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to lie." Grace kissed her forehead. "You told the truth when it mattered most. That's what makes you brave." Maya watched them from a distance, her eyes glistening. She knew justice had been served, but more importantly, a broken child had finally been freed. As Richard Weston was led away in handcuffs, his reflection flickered briefly in the courtroom glass. Once powerful, now powerless. His fortune couldn't save him. His lawyers couldn't protect him, and his lies had finally turned against him. In that moment, everyone in the room understood one thing: money could build walls, but truth would always find a way to break through. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom closed behind them, sealing away months of pain, fear, and uncertainty. Outside, the afternoon sunlight spilled across the courthouse steps, warm and golden, like the first light after a long storm. The cameras were gone. The reporters had drifted away. And for the first time in what felt like forever, there was silence. Peaceful silence. Grace stood there, breathing in the crisp air. For so long, she had only breathed in worry and exhaustion, every breath feeling like a battle. Now she could finally let go. Her eyes turned toward Emily, who stood a few steps below, clutching her teddy bear and staring out at the city streets that once seemed so big and frightening. Maya joined them, a gentle smile softening her tired face. "It's over," she said quietly. The court will finalize everything in the morning, but Richard Weston won't be coming near either of you again." Grace's lips trembled as she nodded. "Thank you, Maya. You fought for us when no one else would." Maya shook her head. "No, Grace, Emily did that. You just gave her the love that gave her strength." Grace turned toward the little girl, her eyes full of tenderness. Emily looked different now, still fragile, still healing, but there was something new in her eyes, a spark, a glimmer of hope that had been hidden for too long. As they walked down the steps, Grace reached for Emily's hand. The small fingers slipped into hers naturally, as if they had always belonged there. Emily leaned close, whispering, "Can we go home now?" Grace smiled softly. "Yes, sweetheart. Let's go home." The next few weeks moved slowly, like the gentle rhythm of a song after chaos. Grace and Emily were moved into a safe home arranged by social services. It was small, just 2 bedrooms, a modest kitchen, and a tiny garden in the back, but it was filled with sunlight, laughter, and something far more precious than luxury, peace. Each morning, Emily would wake up to the smell of pancakes and warm cocoa. Grace, in her apron, would hum old gospel songs as she cooked, her voice low and comforting. The television stayed off most of the time. Instead, they filled the house with conversation, coloring books, and laughter. Sometimes Emily would wake in the middle of the night, trembling from nightmares. Grace would hurry to her side, wrapping her arms around her, whispering softly until the little girl's breathing slowed. "You're safe now," she would say. "No one will ever hurt you again." And every time Emily would whisper back, "I know, Mama Grace." The first time Emily called her Mama, Grace froze. Her heart skipped a beat, tears filling her eyes. She didn't correct her. She didn't have to. From that moment on, she wasn't just a maid or a caretaker. She was family. Meanwhile, the world moved on. The news cycle shifted to other scandals, other stories. Richard Weston's empire collapsed in silence. His business partners distanced themselves. Investors withdrew. And the name that once commanded power now drew only pity and shame. But Grace never spoke about him again. She didn't need revenge. She had freedom, and that was enough. One sunny afternoon, months later, Emily came running into the garden with a sketchbook in hand. "Look, Mama Grace," she said excitedly. Grace wiped her hands on her apron and leaned over. On the page was a drawing 2 stick figures, holding hands under a big yellow sun. One was labeled Emily, the other Mama Grace. Above them, in colorful letters, Emily had written, "My new family." Grace smiled through tears. "That's beautiful, baby." Emily grinned proudly. "Do you think we can hang it in the living room?" "Of course we can," Grace said, her voice soft and trembling. "Right where everyone can see it." That evening, as the sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and gold, they sat on the porch together. Grace sipped tea while Emily drew another picture. The world seemed slower, softer. After a long silence, Emily looked up and said, "Mama Grace, do you think people can change?" Grace thought for a moment, staring at the horizon. "Yes," she said finally, "but only if they want to. And sometimes the ones who hurt us don't change, but we can. We can choose to be better, kinder, stronger." Emily smiled faintly. "Like us?" Grace nodded. "Exactly like us." As night fell, the stars began to appear, tiny sparks scattered across the deep blue sky. Emily leaned against Grace's shoulder, eyes fluttering sleepily. "Thank you for not giving up on me," she murmured. Grace kissed the top of her head. "I never will." The house behind them glowed softly, the drawing on the wall catching the lamplight. 2 figures under a bright sun, holding hands. For Grace, who had once been accused, humiliated and nearly destroyed, life had come full circle. She had lost everything, yet somehow gained more than she ever dreamed possible. And for Emily, the little girl who once trembled in fear, she had found the one thing her mansion, her wealth, her father's empire could never give her: love that didn't hurt. The world would forget the headlines, the trials and the scandals, but somewhere, in a small home filled with laughter, 2 souls who had once been broken had begun again, together. And this time, it wasn't just the beginning of a new chapter. It was the beginning of a new life.